Welcome back to Talent on Tap. You can see I am San's partner today. Brendan Brown, my cohort at Talent on Tap, is visiting Airbnb. Why is he there? He's actually exploring the candidate experience. So we want to bring back the best stories, the best insights to copy shamelessly and to share with you. So on to Brendan Brown.
Thanks, Pat. We're excited to have Jill and Amanda with us here today on Talent on Tap.
Thanks.
Candidate experience is the topic. So last time we connected was about 3 years ago. Jill, you did a great job at Talent Connect in Australia. That was awesome. So what's changed since we've last spoken?
Yeah, so our first kind of overhaul of candidate experience was about 4 years ago that we talked about 3 years ago. And it was really focused on, we broke down the candidate experience to frames. So we have what we call our candidate journey, and we really focused on what candidates know and feel at each point in the experience. And we did some pretty significant overhauls based on that. In the last couple of years, we've really looked at something that's a little bit more subtle from the actual candidate experience side.
Okay.
It has more to do with our internal processes.
And on that, I mean, so much focus you hear about sort of the whiz-bang things people are doing. Here's send a gift basket or this really cool giveaway when someone walks in the door. How do you think about those things as it relates to candidate experience? How do you define candidate experience specifically?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So our first rev was kind of like, what can we give them at the end of the process to surprise and delight them? Like, what kind of swag are we going to give them?
Yep.
And this more recent rev has been more about like, the way that we can give the best candidate experience is to make sure that our candidates are going through a fair and objective process and that we're really using their time well while they're here on site.
Got it. And how do you define objective process?
An objective process. Ultimately, we want every candidate to be treated fairly. We want to give them a shot at the interview process. So when we talk about objective, it's about mapping the interview process as closely as possible to the core skills that we actually need for them to be successful in the job.
Got it. Interesting. So in terms of, so it sounds like really the thesis of your candidate experience is, while gift baskets may be delightful, really what's most important is how someone feels, and that's tied to objectivity. So how do you sort of wire up your team to deal with that? And what about the hiring teams and interviewers? How do you get them prepared for this?
There are a lot of things we do. It does start with making sure that the interview process has specific rubrics and scorecards that are aligned directly with the skills that we need, and then training everyone to make sure that they're calibrated on what that looks like and how to evaluate candidates. Some of the specific things we do is try to avoid bias whenever possible. So for example, we have a take-home exercise that we send to every candidate in the data science interview process.
Okay.
And we ask that that candidate does not provide any information on their final result that includes any information about their name, their experience. We don't want to know anything about them outside of the work that they've shown. So when we actually go and review it, we're able to mitigate some unconscious bias that might come into the process by really focusing on the core skills.
So how is that manifest in terms of changes? I mean, are people changing their opinions of things? I mean, is there a big reveal and say, hey, here's the person's background? I mean, how does the person's background work its way into the process, or does it at all?
Yeah. Well, that's really the first step in one example. There, obviously, when someone comes on site, you're meeting them in person, but there are other things we try to do throughout the process, just to say, where is there potential bias that could come into the process, and how do we potentially solve for that? There's no perfect answer, but it's something we've been working a lot on.
And Jill, how was the reception from the hiring managers and interviewers who, I mean, plenty of people are still focused on someone's CV or their profile and judging a lot off that.
The reception has been good because the results have been really good. And I think at Airbnb, so our mission at Airbnb is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And we really believe that that starts with having employees feel a sense of belonging here at Airbnb. To that end, our recruiting efforts are focused on creating diverse teams. So there's a lot of focus on diversity both internally in the company and on our platform throughout the company. So really the genesis of this work started with a diversity lens, where we started looking at how can we build unbiased, fair, objective process for candidates to help build diversity within the company. And as we went into that work, which, because it's so well aligned with our mission, there wasn't a lot of resistance from hiring teams. Everyone was pretty well aligned with it. We found that the benefit was actually twofold. That the benefit was we were hiring more diverse teams and able to, get better diversity on a bunch of different dimensions, whether it's race or ethnicity or gender or just diversity of thought, or as all tech companies I think find it's great to get people who come from outside of tech to really bring in a new perspective. So we found that we were building more diverse teams, but we also found that we were creating a better candidate experience because of it. A great concrete example of how our experience has changed is, in our first look at candidate experience, we thought we really want people to be connecting with the candidates. So we actually would advise hiring teams, look at the bottom part of the resume, where people list their passions outside of work, and find something that's connective there. And when you walk in, spend the first 5 minutes connecting with the person. That's very, our product is about connecting people. We thought that was a really strong way to start an interview. Well, it turns out that's actually the best way to bias yourself in an interview, is to find the commonality and start there.
So on that, can we just do show me the how not to video? Ready? Let's do this.
Okay.
So I'm a candidate. I'm sitting here. Show me what not to do.
So walking into your room and, Brendan, hey, I looked at your resume. I saw you went to Villanova.
I did.
Yeah, that's so great. My brother goes to Villanova.
No way.
Do you live, did you live on campus?
I lived on campus for 2 years, and then
Great.
2 years off campus. Okay, so what was wrong with that?
So whenever you have those connection points, you're open to, there's all sorts of bias, and if you look in Wikipedia on implicit bias, you'll find, hundreds and hundreds of types of bias, but then you're open to similarity bias or like me bias, where we find this connection point, and then I'm more predisposed to be favorable to any of your answers, and also to softball you essentially during the interview.
And what do you think people are doing that, Amanda, because people want to be comfortable? Why do you think that's such a pervasive bad technique?
Yeah, well, naturally you'd think that would be a good idea because you're making someone comfortable in an interview. So I think that's naturally what people just think they should do.
Right.
But then when you look deeper at the research, you realize that there are other ways to make someone feel comfortable without necessarily finding that that connection point.
Got it.
Ways that you can introduce who you are, talk about what the expectations of the interview are, ask them if they need a quick coffee or water break type of thing. You can make people feel comfortable still without going over their resume.
One of the main things we do in terms of bias is making people aware of potential biases. So everyone goes through unconscious bias training.
Yeah.
Our interviewer training, which we have on our Degreed, which is our learning platform, is very heavily focused on being aware of your biases. So that's kind of the strongest thing. There's no way you can keep people in a bubble throughout the whole interview process and not give any information about them. But the idea that Amanda was talking about is the people who get through the initial stage, kind of where the funnel is at its widest, we want to make sure that that is as unbiased as possible. So that's where it's really essential, and also the most possible to pull names and backgrounds off of some interview types.
And the output of that, you've seen actually the results have changed in terms of the mix of talent coming through.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's close with 3 tips.
Great. The first thing I would say is before you get into interview stages, decide what components or what attributes, whatever you want to call them, competencies, are needed for success in the role, and then stick to them. So decide what they are, decide how you're going to interview for them, and then stick to that. It sounds basic, but it's actually hard to do, especially when you're in a fast-growing company, to really take the time to figure that out. But the more you can figure out what those objective criteria are before launching into the interview process, the more fair and less bias-prone your interview process is going to be.
How about 2 more tips you think people could take away?
You don't have to track everything. I would say starting simple with even tracking the time of each candidate in process. Way back when we did our first rev of candidate experience, we really found that the time in process is a proxy for candidate experience. It's also a proxy for how quickly you're able to make decisions. So time for each candidate to get through the process.
So not time to fill, how long someone literally has been in your process.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, that's a great one.
Yeah, I would say finally be aware of your bias, your potential bias that can be injected into the process. There's so much research out there that you can look into. You don't have to necessarily put a lot of money into that type of thing. It's if you're early on, it's just really important to be aware of that and try to mitigate it whenever you can.
Any suggestion on where to start, like bringing a trainer, just do some self-study? What's the best way to get, if I'm working for a 100-person company, where do I start?
We did put everyone through unconscious bias training here and actually had some of our team members trained on how to give that. So that could be really helpful, but you can also just, the internet has so much research on that.
Fantastic. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so
you.
much.
Thanks.